think we have a good turnout for the audience, and the entrance is slowing down. I think we're ready to begin. Welcome everyone. Again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. My name is Angela Xue, and I am one of the panel team members with Yale ISTF. Thank you for joining us for our first session today to discuss research, education, and knowledge exchange in tropical forest restoration with our amazing panelists. And now, without further ado, I would like to now introduce the moderator for today's panel. We are honored to have Dr. Eva Garen joining us today as the moderator. Dr. Eva Garen is the Program Director of the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative at Yale. Eva has spent over 20 years working on the social aspects of conservation and development in the tropics. Prior to becoming the Director of Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative at Yale in 2012, Eva was a technical advisor on the social aspects of REDD+ with Conservation International's Science and Knowledge Division. Eva has also worked with the U.S. Agency for International Development, Forestry, and Biodiversity teams in Washington, D.C. as Science and Technology Policy Fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. For her postdoctoral research in Panama at Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, Eva worked with cattle ranchers and smallholders on issue of native species reforestation and land restoration in mosaic tropical forest landscape. Eva completed her Master of Environmental Science and PhD both at Yale School of the Environment with concentration in social ecology. And now, before we begin, I would like to remind our audience that we welcome any questions you may have, and we will direct your questions to our speakers. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A chat throughout the presentation, as well as the question and answer segments. And now, without further ado, I will pass it along to Eva. Welcome to ISTF, Eva. The floor is yours now.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela, for such a gracious introduction. And I want to begin today by thanking the conference organizers for their exceptional work coordinating and facilitating this important event. And I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but the students do this on top of their full course schedule. So they really deserve the highest of accolades for their impressive work. And as we all know, they're doing this in a virtual format in light of the global pandemic. But I feel that that makes their efforts and accomplishments even more impressive. So thank you all for your amazing work. And I'd like to welcome everybody for joining us today. It's a really exciting panel. And I'm just so glad to see so many people here and really excited to hear from our panelists and to get all of your questions as we move along. So I'm delighted to be the monitor for today's panel session that's focused on research, implementation, and knowledge exchange in the decade on restoration. And so when I was asked to moderate this section, I was thinking about the title and realized that it is quite expansive and covers three key aspects of restoration, each of which could easily be its own focus of a panel session. However, these themes are interrelated and as such are important to discuss together as we think critically about how to advance restoration efforts around the globe. And I was reflecting on these themes in the context of the Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative, which is the capacity development program I direct, based here at the Yale School of the Environment. And I realized that our programs are really based on these three components. So the courses that we teach are grounded in research in the natural and social sciences from many sources. They draw upon the experiences of people who implement restoration in different contexts around the globe and are designed to support implementation in different ways. And they're also designed to facilitate knowledge exchange among and between the array of people involved with restoration and at different scales using different approaches. So our capacity development model integrates all three of these components, and these topics are indeed intricately connected and intertwined in different ways depending on where you're situated in the restoration process. So I'm really excited to think about them together in a single panel, and we could not have a more exciting set of 3 esteemed speakers to do just that during today's session. So each of the 3 panelists will have 20 minutes to present their work, followed by about 20 to 30 minutes for you, the audience, to ask questions to the panelists. Please submit your questions with the Q&A or within the Q&A box in the Zoom platform, and be sure to specify to whom you're directing the question by adding your name right before your question. And of course, you can ask the same question to more than one of the panelists. So without further ado, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Victoria Reyes-García. So Dr. Garcia is a PhD and has a PhD in anthropology from Florida University and is the ICREA research professor at the Institut de Ciència y Tecnologia Ambientals, ICTA, at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Her research focuses on indigenous and local knowledge systems, particularly in relation to the natural environment and the relevance of this knowledge to understand and deal with the climate and environmental crises. She's participated in the preparation of the global report of the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And she currently directs a research group that analyzes the impacts of global change on various socio-ecosystems and an ERC-funded project on local perceptions of the impacts of climate change. And she's an elected member of the National Academy of Science of the United States. So today, Victoria will be speaking to us about a biocultural approach to restoration. So please join me in welcoming Victoria to the panel.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your very grateful kind introduction. Let me try to share my screen. Are you seeing it now? And in full mode?
Not in slide mode yet.
Yes, now?
Nope, not yet. Let's see. Can you?
No, it's not in the full mode.
But not in the full mode.
No.
Yeah.
That's. And now? Let me just close it, maybe. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Let me just reopen it. Now you don't see anything, right?
Correct.
Sorry about that. I'll just go.
Okay. We have lots of patience for very patient with our virtual conferences because these things take a little time.
I mean, it always works. I mean, when you try it first, but then it doesn't work when you want it to work. Let me try again. I just closed it and then open it again. Now you should be seeing in presentation mode. And now in my screen
we're seeing it, but in your speaker view.
And in now, it's still the same.
Yep.
Okay, let me just use the PDF and then that will probably make it easier. Sorry about that.
That is okay.
Okay, last try. Now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, I don't have any animation, so it should be working. So sorry about that. Thank you again. Let me start by thanking the organizers for the invitation to this very important event, and also for all the, as Eva was saying, all the coordination from the student side that has been excellent. I think I have never been in such a very well organized conference. So I just want to start or to give this idea of what it's a biocultural approach to restoration. The disclaimer here might be that I don't particularly work in restoration, focusing on that as many others in the room do. I work in general with knowledge systems and with conservation and restoration as part of it. So I have prepared this outline or this presentation. I'm going to be dealing with three 4 main topics, just reminding us of the need for restoration. Although I think you're probably the audience doesn't need that reminder, but just to kind of like situate for where I come from, try a little bit of an overview of what have been the goals and the achievements in restoration in the last decade. And then within that idea of looking at the goals and achievement, looking particularly on how Indigenous people and local communities and Indigenous and local knowledge has contributed to restoration. And finally, I will base on what we know about the Indigenous people and local knowledge communities' contribution to restoration. I will just propose some ideas from a new approach to restoration taken from this biocultural perspective. So I'll go quickly, let's say, through this first part, because I think this is kind of like a common understanding of the audience that in the latest IPBES global assessment, or in the only IPBES global assessment, there was this very, very strong message that nature underpins and sustains human quality of life, right? So when we talk about the importance of nature, we are not talking only about the pandas or the elephants, we are just talking about all these organisms that sustains our life on Earth, the life of human on Earth. And the second main finding of this assessment was that nature and the vital contributions that nature makes to people are deteriorating worldwide. So in the IPBES assessment, we look at 18 different contributions to people. You have them listed here, and these contributions go from food and energy to the regulation of the climate or the regulation of ocean acidification, and also supporting identities or learning and inspirations. So when we look at these 18 different contributions to people, we see that in the last 18 years, the trend, and we analyzed all of these one by one, the trend has been a declining trend. So most of the contributions that nature makes to our life on Earth are decreasing, except for the contributions to energy, food, and feed. So that was like the second main message. And oh, sorry, the slides, I had made some change on the slide. They are not on the PDF. Here I wanted to, here in this slide, I highlight that climate and biodiversity are inextricably linked, but I wanted to also highlight that the other important concept or finding of the IPBES platform is that the drivers what drives nature loss there are 5 main drivers that have to do with the excessive use of nature, pollution, invasive species, climate change. But all these kind of like drivers of climate change are actually underpinned by other indirect drivers that have to do with social changes and actually with values and behavior. And I'm just gonna kind of like, if you allow me, I really want to, because I made change to this presentation, even if it's in the non-slide forms. Do you mind if I kind of like switch back to the, I'm really sorry about that. Is that fine?
Sure, go ahead. That's
yes,
okay.
Sorry, this is.
That's okay.
I'm sorry, I'm making a mess of your.
Not at all.
Let me just maybe make. So if I do like this, you don't see them. You don't see the full screen, right?
No, we still see your presentation view, but you could maybe make the slides a little bit bigger, and then we.
But now you see it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I'll just make this. Okay, so so I was just. Is that fine? You see it more or less?
Cut off.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If you hide the tab up top, then it'll give a little more space. Like if you click that little button up on the right-hand side, the arrow that goes up on the very right-hand corner. Go down a little lower. I can't, oh, just go ahead. Sorry. But you can.
Oh, okay. I was talking about the direct drivers. So we have these direct drivers of change in nature, right? But we have also all these indirect drivers like demographic change, economic change, and values and behaviors. So because of this state of the degradation of nature, in the in some years ago, like in 10 years ago, the Convention of Biological Diversity set these 20 different targets on how we need, what do we need to do to conserve nature. And one of these targets, the Aichi target number 15, was to enhance resilience through ecological restoration, right? So there was this common goal that all the countries that signed the Convention of Global of the Biodiversity agreed in trying to restore at least 15% of the degraded ecosystems by 2020, right? So part of what we have done in IPBES has been to assess the progress towards this target. We assess progress toward every single target of these 20s, right? And when you look at the result, the main finding is that there is not enough data to assess progress toward this HE target of number 15, the one on restoration, right? So there is not a very good data set that allows us to see how well have we moved toward this target. And also, even from the data that is there, most programs, they just tend to focus on short-term establishment success indicators, right? So we are not looking at the long term, these programs are not looking at the long term. So basically, the assessment conclude that we really don't know how well have we done with restorations. As I was telling, one of the important contributions of the IPBES assessment is that we didn't look only at scientific literature, what the scientists have said about restoration. We also look at other sources of knowledge, and we were using this what it's known as a multiple evidence-based approach, in which we think that different strains of knowledge, you have represented here the scientific knowledge, but also like other forms of knowledge, indigenous and local knowledge, or lay knowledge, or practitioner knowledge, they could all contribute to give an enriched picture, an enriched view of a situation, right? So we wanted to bring indigenous knowledge to this assessment of restoration. So we did this very particular work trying to look at what have been the contributions to achieve this target on restoration. And we look particularly at 4 different points. The first one that we look at is at how indigenous and local knowledge has contributed or can contribute to efforts on restoration, right? So the idea behind that is that indigenous people, they live in close relationship with the environment, so they understand how the different elements of the environment relate together, and what are the dynamics that affect them. So when we look at the literature, we see that there has been already some use of indigenous and local knowledge in planning restoration. And then here it has been very important, or it can be of a lot of importance, the use of cultural, what we in anthropology we call cultural keystone species, which is like something similar to what in ecology is called keystone species, but emphasizing the idea that some species are of exceptional significance for cultural groups, right? So they are the culture or the identity of the group, it's really related to these species, right? So in that sense, indigenous knowledge could contribute to kind of like select what are the species that could be used in restoration, right? Indigenous knowledge can also be used to estimate baselines or to provide ideas of what were the baselines, because when we talk about restoring, we need to think restoring to what, no? So indigenous people have ideas of what were the baselines. So that's another contribution that indigenous and local knowledge could do to restoration. Indigenous and local knowledge has been used in restoration processes. As I was saying, some of the traditional indigenous management practices have been that incorporate this indigenous knowledge has been already used in some restoration efforts, like here I'm just showing an example of in Australia, right, where they look at how indigenous people have used fire management, anthropogenic burning, to actually restore the process on the ecosystem, right? So some of the management practices of indigenous people can be of use in planning or in thinking of these restoration processes. Another area in where indigenous and local knowledge could help in restoration is in monitoring. There are many projects that have used community monitoring to actually see what is the state of the forest, right? And in that sense, community monitoring could also be helping in this effort of restoration, particularly because, as we say, there is no data. There is not a lot of data or data that only focus on short-term effects of restoration, right? So indigenous people could contribute here. The second area where indigenous and local knowledge could contribute to restoration is in participation. There is some evidence that when local people are involved in the activities, conservation activities in general, these activities are better perceived, better received, and there is more chances of success of these activities, no? And this is contrary or in phase of these top-down plan activities where that often or sometimes results in conflicts. But when we look at this kind of like this analysis, there are two areas where we didn't find a lot of evidence. And this is the areas where I think a new approach for restoration should be focusing, right? One is how indigenous people conceptualize nature, and the other one is based on the rights. So in the first area that I think it's missing and we are not giving enough importance is this idea that indigenous people, they have different concepts and different understandings, different cosmovisions about what is nature, and nature is often thought as connected to human beings, right? If you remember the slides where I got panicked, I was showing you this slide about the drivers of change. Most of the restoration activities try to make an incidence in this part of the graph, right? You're just trying to work with biodiversity, but the drivers of actual biodiversity loss, the drivers of nature kind of like going down, is it's in the values and behaviors that people display towards nature, right? So if we think about how indigenous people have a very different kind of way of relating to nature, that it's based more on this idea of relationality, right? Nature, it not only have an intrinsic value or an instrumental value, but it also has a relational value with people, right? In which humans are only custodians of nature for future generations, or nature is given a kind of like an entity in itself, right? Not only in relationship to people. When we think about these values, we could think that there is much to learn on restoration and in general in conservation science about the values that indigenous people have, not only about their knowledge and their management practices more down to earth, but also about how they conceptualize human relationship with nature. And here I just want to bring the work of Dr. Kimmerer, who has advanced this concept of reciprocal restoration, right? In which there is a need to reinforce both the land, the nature, but also the culture, and revitalize the cultures that are actually connected to this nature. And I just like suggest here, I don't think you said, but here there is a link to her presentation on that topic. And just to finalize, or to just trying to get to a close, the last area where I think this new approach to restoration needs to kind of like make more work forward is this idea of recognizing local people and indigenous people's rights when thinking about this restoration. And this comes from the evidence that decisions on which areas needs to be restored or which species should be restoring, it's mostly based in biological concepts, in biological kind of like decisions, but sometimes they don't, or oftentimes they don't take into account local concerns. No? And this is kind of like in contrast with the evidence that actually most of the lands or a big part of the lands that are in good shape now overlap with lands of indigenous and local people, right? So we have some evidence there that indigenous people and local people have been able to maintain some of the forests that we or very biodiversity rich areas that we maintain. And nevertheless, we are not trying to learn from them on how these areas have been created. And I just want to remind in this last part that indigenous peoples have ownership rights to many of their lands where they live, and this is recognized under international rights law. No? So there are the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that give them rights to kind of like their lands, their cultural identities, their education, health, right? And some of the, when we think about all these in general conservation projects or in general how we decide what to do, sometimes these rights are not really taken into account. So just to conclude quickly, and I'm sorry, with all these technical issues, maybe I went through very quickly, but the main idea of this biocultural approach to ecosystem restoration is that such a approach should include multiple knowledge systems. So it should be based in knowledge that comes from different sources. It should promote participation of local people in all stages of the restoration process, not only on kind of like the restoration in itself, planting the trees, but also in deciding how to plant, where to plant, which and what is the final aim that we have with this restoration process. It should acknowledge difference in relational values, right? So there are many ways in which we can relate to nature. And finally, it should be right-based, respecting the rights of people. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And sorry again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Victoria, for such a really interesting and insightful presentation about the biocultural approach. I'm really excited to discuss these themes in more detail during the question and answer session. But I think now, for the sake of time, we'll move on to our next speaker, and then we'll come back to everything at the end. So thank you. Okay, so we're now going to be moving on to Ramesh Venkataraman. And Ramesh has been actively engaged in ecological restoration since 2007. He's the managing trustee of Junglescapes Charitable Trust, which is a nonprofit engaged in restoration of degraded forest ecosystems in a biodiversity hotspot in India. The nonprofit follows a community participative model where local village communities, mostly indigenous, are active partners in the projects. Junglescapes received the SARE Full Circle Award in 2017 for its inclusive model of restoration. Over 3,500 acres of degraded forests have been restored to healthy wildlife habitats so far. And since 2017, Ramesh is on the board of directors for the Society for Ecological Restoration, known as SARE, the leading world body for ecological restoration. He is currently the chair of the Ad Hoc Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SARE. A certified ecological restoration practitioner, his areas of specialization include management of invasive alien plant species, assisted natural regeneration, design of restoration projects for rewilding a keystone fauna, and restoration of fire areas affected by fire. He's active in spreading awareness about ecological restoration and has been a speaker at many restoration conferences at the national and the international levels. And he writes regularly on conservation and restoration topics, and also runs a training program on ecological restoration in collaboration with a leading educational institution in India. So today, Ramesh will be speaking to us about the panel theme from the perspective of a restoration practitioner and of restoration in the developing world. So please join me in welcoming Ramesh.
Thank you very much, Eva, for that introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this very topical and interesting conference. Let me try and share my screen now. I hope my screen is visible. I see
Yes,
Yes.
that looks better.
yes, perfect.
Yeah. So I'll start by a brief introduction of the work that we do. Junglescapes is a grassroots organization engaged in the restoration of degraded forests. We've been doing this since 2008. Our work is in the Western Ghats, which is a 1,000-mile long mountain range on the western coast of peninsular India. It's a global biodiversity hotspot. Project site is Bandipur National Park, which is an important tiger and elephant habitat. It is a protected area characterized by tropical dry and moist forests. The main degradation factor is colonization by invasive alien species, particularly Lantana camara, and we have restored around 1,400 hectares until now, of which around 50% have shown good revival and reached self-sustaining levels. And as Eva mentioned, we follow a participative model where indigenous communities living around the forest are active partners in the restoration efforts. I'll be sharing some perspectives on the topic of today, both as a restoration practitioner and from the point of view of restoration in the developing world. We are entering the second year of the UN decade, and we still face a number of challenges in the field of restoration. There is not enough awareness of what ecological restoration is and why is it important amongst a number of external stakeholders whose actions, unfortunately, have the ability to influence restoration to a fair degree. Scaling up is again a challenge. Most restoration projects, particularly in the developing world, are relatively small in size and standalone. The climate change agenda threatens to kind of overshadow the restoration and biodiversity agendas, and inclusivity in terms of geography, demography, and cultures continues to be a challenge. I'll move on to the first topic. Can you give me a minute, please? Is this presentation being shared by Angela? Or,
Yes, we can see it. Mhm.
Can I share? Can I share my version, please, Eva?
Ramesh, would you like me to share the presentation instead?
No, I'll do it.
We were seeing yours, Ramesh.
Missing some of the changes. Just give me a minute, please. I'm sorry. Yeah, I got the right one now.
Yes.
Yeah, moving on to the first aspect of the topic, which is restoration research. The key question is, how can research play a greater role in addressing the challenges that we face, as well as in increasing the impact of restoration on the ground? This raises some supplementary questions. Do we need a shift in balance towards applied research? Should basic research focus more on themes that are strategically important? How can research stay ahead of the degradation curve? And how do we establish better feedback loops between research and practice? As we all know, the focus of the UN decade is on action on the ground. And this would mean that we might require a shift in emphasis of research and a shift of research in resources as well towards applied research, which looks into finding solutions for specific field challenges. An example of a field challenge where research inputs would be most welcome is scaling up, because as a restorer, when I try to scale up, I look for answers to some important questions like what would be the optimum scale of a project site at which the effectiveness of the project does not get diluted. Can research help me with low-cost restoration methods, which provides a palette of restoration options? And how do I monitor large restoration sites, which is quite a challenge? The other question is, how do we align basic research better with the strategic themes that we have? These are some examples of strategic themes. Can research come up with more evidence that the carbon sequestration potential of restored and biodiverse forests is better than that of monocultural plantations, because this will help drive a lot of carbon funding towards ecological restoration. Can research highlight the incremental ecosystem service potential of restored forests? And this again could play a key role in formulating state policies or government policies. Can research assess the efficacy of low-cost natural regeneration approaches, which is very relevant in the developing world where restorers face severe fund crunches. A good example of basic research aligned with strategic goals is that of assisted natural regeneration. I bring this example because our work is primarily based on assisted natural regeneration, even though we do practice active interventions to a certain degree. Most standards and guidelines recommend ANR only in the case of mild degradation scenarios, where there is sufficient native plant propagules on the site, and the site is proximate to undisturbed areas. But there is field evidence coming from around the world which shows that ANR is effective even in sites with higher levels of degradation. And this is what we have experienced in our project site as well. However, there is still inadequate research on ANR as a methodology, and also on the relative merits of ANR vis-a-vis active intervention methods. As a result, we could be in a situation where the lack of research limits wider adoption of these lower cost restoration approaches. Staying ahead of the degradation curve, this is a real life case study from our project area. We are seeing rapid colonization by a new invasive species, which is Senna spectabilis, over the last 5 to 6 years. This is native to South America, and there is practically no research till date on the characteristics of Senna spectabilis. As a result, field practitioners are trying out various methods with insufficient or inadequate results. And literally, we are chasing the invasion and with very limited knowledge. So this highlights the importance of research staying ahead of the degradation curve and quickly addressing emerging challenges. Establishing feedback loops between research and practice, very important to make sure that future research on similar topics has a sharper focus, as well as to minimize a disconnect between what happens in research and what happens in the field. Moving on to the second aspect of the topic, which is restoration education. Historically, restoration education has focused on restoration professionals, could be emerging professionals or mid-career professionals. But then this raises an important question, whether we need to expand the definition of the target audience for education to include external stakeholders, as well as field implementers who are mostly members of the local community. We saw earlier as to how the external stakeholders understanding and knowledge of ecological restoration is at a very basic level now. It is below basic levels, I would say. However, the unfortunate part is that these stakeholders can influence restoration efforts to a very large extent. And therefore, educating them on restoration is very important, and getting their buy-in is very important if we need to achieve the goals of the UN decade. To give a very simple example of funding in my context in India, all corporates in India have to contribute 2% of their profits towards social causes. And I was looking at the numbers for the last 2 years. Less than 0.5% of this money has gone to ecological restoration. It is not because of a lack of intent, but it's mainly because of the lack of awareness of restoration being an avenue which they can support. Capacity for sound and scientific restoration planning and management continues to be a gap in many developing regions. There are multiple reasons for this. One of the main reasons is that unlike in the West, ecological restoration is still not part of educational curriculum in many countries. There are limited number of projects happening on the ground, so field experience opportunities are also limited, and restoration as a career is not yet attractive, so students are not too keen to take up restoration education. So what can we do to increase the capacity for restoration and create more number of restoration professionals? In the longer term, we should encourage inclusion of restoration programs in university curriculum. In the medium term, we could integrate certification programs which are existing right now, like the SERP program with existing university programs. Short term, curate bridge certification courses for aspiring restorers from diverse fields. This is similar to what Eva mentioned, that we are running a course in India, which is a 3-month-long course, which gives a very basic understanding of ecological restoration. And also create more restoration internship opportunities. I feel we need cross-country internship opportunities, and this might require funding for students who may not be able to travel cross-country. Large-scale restoration also requires a number of well-trained field personnel who carry out activities like field supervision or field surveys, actual restoration activities, etc. Most of the potential candidates are from lower education levels, mostly high school or below high school levels, and we need to create simpler learning modules which are contextualized to the local context. We could also involve local communities and their knowledge in restoration projects to create restoration capacity within a short period of time by leveraging on their traditional knowledge and competencies. I'll share the example of Junglescapes case study of enhancing restoration capability through community partnerships. Most of the indigenous communities in our project area were living inside the forest for many centuries, and they got relocated outside the forest when the national park was formed in the 70s. And we found that the livelihood opportunities were quite limited. It was mainly seasonal work in local farms for 3 to 4 months a year, and therefore the economic condition was quite poor. This created a disconnect with the forest, and there was no access to forest resources. There was a gradual diminishing of traditional ecological knowledge, and this led to a situation where these community members could potentially engage in activities which lead to greater degradation. So when the restoration started and they started getting involved, there was a paradigm shift. The restoration created alternate livelihoods. It helped them reconnect with their traditional heritage and knowledge, and gradually a sense of ecological stewardship started developing. We now have 70 indigenous community members who are our restoration partners, including 12 women. There are multiple self-help groups, which are self-governed groups. Each group plays an active role in restoration at site level restoration planning and implementation. We have a restoration calendar which covers the entire year, so their livelihood is ensured throughout the year. Around 50% of the participants are youngsters. This helps transition of traditional knowledge from the elders to the younger generation. We started with 1 village in 2008, and now we have 7 villages participating. The number of members participating has gone from 15 to 70, and average family incomes have tripled. And more importantly, restoration outcomes have been impacted quite positively. Moving on to the third aspect of the discussion, which is knowledge exchange. Knowledge exchange, in my view, is critical for tropical forest restoration. If we want to maximize synergies between projects, shorten learning curves is very important, because the learning curve in restoration tends to be quite long. So we need to find ways of shortening the learning curve. If we want to unlock multi-layered potential of collective scale, and we want to leverage multiple knowledge streams. Looking at the map of tropical forests, I could see a fair degree of homogeneity in ecological zones, and as there is also commonality in degradation factors across many regions. This shows that there is intrinsic potential for maximizing synergies through collaborations between various project managers. This is an example from our own experience of shortening the learning curve. When we started our work, there are hardly any precedents in the southern part of India on management of Lantana camara, and therefore we contacted another organization in North India, which is about 1,600 miles away. They had done over 8,000 hectares of restoration of Lantana camara invaded areas, and this helped us gain knowledge on both the methods of removal of the species as well as in post-removal restoration of those sites. However, they were working on grassland habitats, whereas we are working in forest habitats, and therefore we needed to adapt the knowledge to our context. However, this helped shortening the learning curve by at least 5 to 6 years. Unlocking multi-layered potential of collective scale is a major opportunity that's available to us. By collective scale, I mean a collection of projects which come under a common thematic umbrella. So this will help us string projects together to achieve scale. We could maximize ecological outcomes if these project sites are contiguous with each other. It will also increase attractiveness to large grant-making agencies, because increasingly the large grant-making agencies are looking at projects above a particular threshold, so they're not entertaining small project applications. And it will also enable us to access carbon funding. Because carbon funding, again, the certification is an expensive process, and you need a minimum size in order for the project to be viable. Leveraging multiple knowledge streams, our experience as we have been using a mix of scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge. The scientific knowledge has been giving us the conceptual framework, for example, understanding the characteristics of the species we are working with, methods of removal and post-removal restoration, how do we manage secondary species, etc. Whereas traditional knowledge has been helping us understand the site level biotic and abiotic parameters. Also, the local communities have excellent knowledge of native flora and their propagation methods, and they have keen knowledge of the flora-fauna associations, which is very important when we are trying to create habitats for wildlife. And therefore, you can see that the traditional knowledge is helping us more in the restoration of the lantana removed areas, whereas scientific knowledge is helping us in better removal and management of secondary invasives. So how do we promote greater knowledge exchange? We could document and publish good practice field methods and outcomes more extensively than what we are doing now. It's very hard to find compendiums of good practices right now if you're looking at tropical forest restoration. We should have an inventory of tropical forest restoration projects so that as a practitioner, I can reach out to other practitioners across the region. We should explore more intra-region and inter-region project collaborations. I do not think there are too many collaborations happening right now, and this could be a good way to gain synergies. We also need to create frameworks for project consortiums. It's not easy to form consortiums. It's a fairly complicated exercise. So we need to create frameworks for consortiums. And lastly, we need to mainstream traditional ecological knowledge rather than treat it as a good practice exception. Right now, it is treated as a good practice exception, but we need to mainstream traditional knowledge in a more focused manner.
Thank you.
That brings me to the end of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ramesh. Really, really such an insightful presentation. And thank you for sharing your experiences with Junglescapes in India. And you gave us a lot of really rich examples to think about related to all the themes of the panel. So I look forward to discussing your work further with all the participants during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Eva.
much.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So we'll move on now to our third and final speaker, Dr. Karen Holl.
Ramesh needs to stop sharing his screen, sir.
Yes, Ramesh, can you stop sharing your screen? There we go. Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
Can't get myself set up till he goes.
Okay, so I will introduce now Dr. Karen Holl. And Karen is a professor of environmental studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research focuses on understanding how local and landscape scale processes affect ecosystem recovery from human disturbance and using this information to restore damaged ecosystems. Her current research focuses in rainforests in Latin America and in chaparral, grassland, and riparian systems in California. She advises numerous public and private agencies on land management and restoration. And recently, she's been working to improve the outcomes of the effort of many large-scale tree growing campaigns. In 2008, she was selected as an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellow and is committed to communicating with policymakers and the public. She teaches courses in restoration ecology, conservation biology, and environmental problem solving. And she served as chair of the Environmental Studies Department and the faculty director of the Ken Norris Center for Natural History at the University of Santa Cruz. And she's a fellow of the California Academy of Sciences and the Ecological Society of America, and was the 2017 winner of the Theodore Sperry Award of the Society for Ecological Restoration. And her primer of ecological restoration was published by Island Press in 2020. So today, Karen will be speaking to us about improving outcomes of forest restoration efforts over space and time. So please join me in welcoming Karen. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, so everybody seeing that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, we're all good. Okay, so as Eva said, this is a huge topic today to talk about knowledge exchange, research, and implementation. I'm going to focus mostly on implementation and research. Just a second, I want that. Okay. So as you know, there's a huge amount of ambition to do a lot of forest restoration and tree planting, and this is focused across. So the problem here is not the ambition, as this audience knows. The problem is the actual, we're not doing that well so far. And we know that despite these huge efforts to do forest restoration, we're still losing forests worldwide, which highlights the importance of, first of all, protecting intact forests. The other even more concerning factor to me is that there's been a number of studies, particularly from Latin America recently, showing that even when we are restoring forests, that it's not lasting very long and that it's being re-cleared within a few decades. And so we really need to be thinking about how we could do restoration, forest restoration better. And what I think we need to start with in the planning and implementation is we need to be clear about how we're defining restoration. There's a lot of different definitions of restoration, starting from the definitions of SUR, focusing on a continuum, but mostly on trying to restore some semblance of what was there before. There's large initiatives for forest landscape restoration, more recently, which incorporates more humans. And more recently, there's been massive tree planting campaigns for which it's often not even clear why people are planting trees. Sometimes it is. And as Victoria talked about, I mean, these aren't the only definitions. There's obviously indigenous definitions, all sorts of definitions. The point being, people define restoration very differently. And it's not to say that one is sort of better than the other, but I think it's really, really key that in individual projects, we make it clear what we're trying to achieve, because only then can we actually choose where to do it, how to do it. And this process of defining and evaluate whether it succeeded, and this process of making decisions about what the goals of the projects have to be inclusive with the different stakeholders. So in order to improve the success of both the restoration and tree planting campaigns, I think that we really need to be doing a better job of planning and thinking about why, where, and how we're doing it. People restore forests for a lot of different reasons, oftentimes for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, for livelihoods. And some of these goals, sometimes we can achieve more than one goal, but there are often contrasting, we can't necessarily always achieve all of them. And so we really need to be clear like what the specific goals and objectives are of projects. And just to give an example of some of these potentially conflicting goals, and I just want to acknowledge that this is a really oversimplified example because there's often different goals within, scales, but a lot of the projects that are happening at the global down to the local, they have different goals. And so I'm going to use the Atlantic Forest, which is a system that I collaborate with my collaborator, Peter Brock-Colleone, a lot on, as an example of these goals. So a lot of the funders at the international scale are focusing on carbon sequestration. There are other funders who are that are interested in carbon sequestration as well as biodiversity at the same time. In Brazil, at the national level, the big legislation under the forest law is focused on improving water quality. But at the local scale, as the previous speakers have said, it's the local landowners who are doing these projects. And a lot of times, those people who are living on the land, we need to think about, they want food, firewood, and income, and in order or other ways to make income on the land. And to be order to do that, those species that they're planting or the approach that they're taking may be different than what you would do to sequester carbon. And so we really need to be thinking about different projects, different participatory processes at the at the regional scale as well as the local scale to make sure that some of these goals and objectives are reconciled early on. And one of the ways that this has been done in the Atlantic Forest is through the Atlantic Forest Pac, which is a coalition of over 270 nonprofit, government, academic groups, businesses, and a lot of different stakeholders trying to come up with ways to balance some of these different goals across the landscape, developing best practices, identifying research priorities, and then following up on them, and also trying to build best practices and monitoring protocols. Secondly, we need to be thinking about where we're going to restore. And a lot of these global maps say that there are so many areas that we restore, but again, you have to think about the fact that people are using that land. And so one of what I think was just as an example of, I think was sort of a better example of that is actually moving to the United States, was work by Susan Cook Patton, a recent article, where they were really looking at, where can we do more tree planting, forest restoration for carbon in this particular case primarily, but thinking about, where might be areas that would be more likely over the long term to be maintained. So looking at places that might be more frequently flooded or having challenging soil conditions, areas that are protected, but really trying to do some of this long-term planning. And the other thing they did besides mapping it was they actually talked to practitioners about the feasibility and costs of, whether this was doable and not just putting these numbers on a map. And then looking at, the fact that these priorities would probably be quite different regionally where you're working. And I think that's true throughout the globe. And the third question we need to be asked is, how are we going to do restoration if we know, why we are doing it, and tailoring the approaches to the particular restoration projects. And so there's a continuum of restoration or tree growing approaches. And in some cases, natural regeneration may be the most cost-effective way to do it, but that may not meet stakeholder needs if people want specific tree species for food and fodder from the land. Moving on, there's been a lot of success with assisted natural regeneration and farmer-managed natural regeneration, sort of facilitating recovery. And as Ramesh said, I think that there could be a lot more research done in this area on the outcomes for both ecologically and socially. There are going to be other times that people are planting trees and doing, I'm not sort of on the restoration continuum, but planting trees mostly for agroforestry and monoculture plantations. And so that also needs to be thought of sort of in the spectrum too. And in fact, there was a really interesting paper that came out by Martin et al. That people primarily plant trees. A lot of these tree planting efforts are for utility more than biodiversity. And then in some cases for restoration, you want to be doing mixed species tree planting if that's sort of the target and you have the resources and it recovers slowly. So my point here is that the most appropriate strategy for restoration depends on local ecological and social conditions and project goals, and they really need to be tailored to that. We also really need to be thinking about planning for the long term in these projects. And as the previous speakers have said, make sure the stakeholders are engaged throughout the process and that they get some benefits, that we ensure land tenure, secure land tenure, and we're really thinking towards the future and selecting species that are likely to survive in future climate conditions, And also during the planning process, thinking about the long-term maintenance, monitoring, and adaptive management. Because a lot of these initiatives really focus on just how many hectares we're going to restore, how many trees we're going to plant. But if we want the many benefits that people are hoping from these restoration projects, we really need these to last for decades to centuries. And so to do that, we really need to be thinking about, you know, who's going to maintain these over time. So, but then what I'd like to do is to move on to research and really thinking about, you know, how we would improve that. And that's actually, obviously, as a professor, that's something I think about, and somebody who does research, I think about a lot. And as Ramesh said, we have a lot of these really small scale projects, but the question is if we're trying to take these little, you know, meters, you know, tens of meters plots, or even site level projects, how do we scale those up to when we're trying to restore large areas? So we really need to be integrating restoration projects in the science and practice at large spatial scales. And this means setting up experiments in between scientists and practitioners. And I think we could be doing that a lot better. That's something that is starting to happen again in the Atlantic forest example that I talked about earlier, that they are doing a lot of that. And that's something that I've been in my own work really trying to do, is to scale up and think about how we could better integrate science and practice from the beginning. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of my own primary tropical forest restoration project, but I won't go into detail. I've been working for about the last couple of decades thinking about using applied nucleation or planting tree islands as a restoration strategy. And the idea here is that if natural regeneration, which can be a very viable option in some landscapes, happens rather slowly, and we know that plantations, particularly monocultures of trees, can result in pretty homogeneous habitat conditions. We also know that forests tend to recover naturally in a patchy manner. And so what we've been looking at is this idea of applied nucleation, and can you plant these islands or nuclei of trees that then attract birds and bats in tropical forests and increase seed dispersal, and also create a more favorable microclimate to facilitate forest recovery in a way that better simulates the heterogeneous process of recovery, and also requires less resources because you have to plant less of an area. And so this is a project that I've been working on. We're now going into year 18 in Southern Costa Rica with my co-PI, Zach Sahawi. I'm only going to briefly go over it because of time, but also because Miriam San Jose will be talking in the session on evaluating restoration success later this morning on this project. But what we did was we compared natural regeneration, applied nucleation, and plantation approaches at 15 sites in Southern Costa Rica. And so we have each treatment replicated at each site with 3 different tree island sizes, and then an unplanted and a fully planted area. And we've been monitoring those sites over time. And in a nutshell, what we found from this project, and it's summarized in this paper, and there's a lot of information and video on my website that you can look at, is that applied nucleation and plantation restoration strategies both facilitate recovery in our system. They enhance the recovery of most functions and floral and faunal groups. And so it seems to be a relatively useful strategy from an ecological standpoint. There are some concerns socially because it looks a little messier than planting rows of trees. And so that raises concern for landowners. So it might not work in all cases, but from an ecological standpoint, it's worked pretty well. But this project is very much a scientific study. And so over time, what I've been trying to do with this approach is think about, well, how could we really scale this up and test this with practitioners in a larger landscape? And so just some ideas of what that, or sort of my evolution in this project, are the following. First of all, we set up another experiment with my collaborator Pedro in the Atlantic forest, where we've increased the size of the plots, where we have sort of 1 hectare plots. But the other thing we added into this was Pedro wanted to use strip planting. And the reason for that is that he just felt that was more practical for practitioners, because that's the way they plant trees in Brazil in the Atlantic forest. And they also prepare the soil too. And so it was just easier to do it in lines. And so we've compared these different strategies. We set up this project about 4 years ago. Unfortunately, I don't have much data because we were supposed to be in the field last spring, March or April, May, collecting data, but due to COVID, that wasn't possible. But I'm hoping he and I are working together to get the data this year. So I'll have more to tell you about how the different strategies have worked out. But I think it's an interesting approach to look at a different way of creating these same types of heterogeneous habitats, but in a way that might be more practical. The other thing that he's done is another idea, which is thinking about, how do we scale this up? Well, we also have to think about cost. And so he's been working with the eucalyptus companies in Brazil. And in Brazil, a lot of income comes from producing, or the pulp producers who produce eucalyptus, which is not a native species. And so what he's been working on is interplanting these eucalyptus with native species. And what happens is the eucalyptus grow a lot faster, and then logging them out after 5 to 7 years to provide income. And so they don't have a long-term impact on the ecosystem, but using that to help pay for restoration. So you can start taking these ideas of planting in these spatially patterned ways and then scaling them up. And so what it looks like after they logged is that you have these native species strips, and then over time, the idea is that as these native species grow up, then they would facilitate recovery in the intervening areas. The other way that we've been working to, sorry, just checking my time here. The other way that we've been working to scale up here is by synthesizing results. And so I've been working with Starry Sprinkle and Sarah Wilson at Conservation International to create an applied nucleation restoration guide for tropical forests that synthesizes results of about 6 different case studies and provides general guidance. And then I'm actually working with Conservation International now on Rio Terra in Brazil, where they're starting to use this approach on a 350 hectare area. And they're creating really large nuclei, but I'm really interested to see how this works out. But we've been kind of talking about the design from the very beginning. I think it's also really important to, on the science side, to replicate restoration methods at multiple sites and not just one site and make generalizations. This is one of my plantation plots in Costa Rica after 9 years, which is what most of the sites look like. But this is another one of my plantation plots after about 8 years. And so we see, because we replicated at multiple sites, we see a huge amount of variability. And we actually found that the tree biomass varied by more than an order of magnitude after 6 to 9 years, which was explained by the length of, largely by the length of pasture use. But the main take-home point here is that, particularly from a standpoint of recommending different restoration strategies, I think we really need to be, we have to be working at multiple sites and looking at what works at, not just, they may just be idiosyncratic results at one site, how can we generalize? And also, of course, how do we tailor those to localized conditions? We can have sort of this toolkit, but we obviously have to consider local conditions. I think there are other ways to compare results across regions. We could be setting up more parallel experiments, Ramesh mentioned, and we could also be synthesizing results. And there's a number of different meta-analyses now that are starting to do that, and there's more regionally. We also need longer term studies. So most restoration projects are like less than 3 years, most monitoring is done for only a couple of years, and most ecological studies are less than 5 years. And what we know is that results change quickly over time. And what we really know very little about is whether later successional species establish. And that's something we're really working now on our research in Costa Rica. Just quickly, this shows the number of tree roots per meter squared in our 4 different restoration treatments, including reference forest. And we find, this is after a decade, we find that at that point, you have a lot of, there's actually a lot of establishment of early successional, these small seeded species, but we still don't have a lot of establishment of these large seeded later successional species, even in our applied nucleation and plantation plots. And we really need to know how these forests are actually recovering over time. So in my last couple minutes here, I just wanted to quickly, and I'm sorry I don't have time, talk more about education and information exchange. There's a lot of groups now that are doing different types, and I think we need these groups at the regional and the global scale, but there's a number of different groups that are different stages in trying to provide training, trying to share information, that are starting their work. There's also a number of training programs, and I want to give a shout out to ELTI because I think they're doing a fabulous job of providing various types of trainings for people all over the world online. And I think that the pandemic, one thing it has done is offered more opportunities to do that. I'm involved in a group that's developing various online content for teaching in the tropics that has various case studies, and we've put together a couple of case studies on our work in Costa Rica in both English and Spanish. And then increasingly, I think we need to be really sharing results more. And there's more and more, there are these online tools where people can at least share information and approaches that then again would be tailored at the local scale. And there's a great paper that just is on press in Journal of Applied Ecology, where they talk about a lot of these online databases, and particularly this Diversity for Forest Restoration database focuses on, started out as designing, helping with species selection for dry forest restoration in Colombia, but then is slowly expanding regionally. So you're sharing a lot of information there. So we'll just say in conclusion, we've come a long way. We still have a long way to go in really taking the knowledge that we have about restoration and applying that. Also, you know, we obviously need to be, as the other speakers talk about, including stakeholders, working at larger scales and doing a better job of integrating the science and the on-the-ground restoration. So thanks a lot. I know it was quick. There's more information at my website on some stuff that I do. And as Eva mentioned, one of my efforts to try to, with Knowledge Exchange, was to write a really straightforward and short primer on ecological restoration. So just wanted to make a quick plug there. And thanks for listening.
Fantastic, Karen. Thank you so much. That looks like a wonderful primer, and thank you for sharing that. So we have about 15, 16 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. You guys have been actively putting some really great questions into the chat, and so, or into the Q&A box. So I've been looking through those, and I'll throw some of those out there for the speakers to answer. But I think what I'm going to do is first just kick off the question and answer session with a bigger question that you each touch upon this aspect. And so I'd love to hear a little bit from all of you, and then we'll go into the specific questions that we have in the Q&A chat box. So here's a big question. It's a tough one, but I think it's something that will be interesting to start the discussion. So we hear about the complexity of each site where restoration is taking place, and each of you talked about that either in terms of ecological complexity or sociocultural and political complexity, and the need to understand this complexity to effectively work with landholders and traditional communities to design and implement appropriate and enduring restoration interventions. But we also hear about the need to scale restoration interventions and to do so quickly to meet global targets. So I would love to hear from each of you about this seemingly contradictory stance. You know, we have to be local and very comprehensive, but we have to scale things very quickly at this massive scale. So sort of being place-based and then having to scale across thousands, if not millions of hectares at a really fast pace. So I'm going to put this out for, and maybe Karen, you can speak to this, since you just talked about scale so much in your presentation, and then would love to hear from Victoria and Ramesh as well, if you have any thoughts about that.
So I have two responses. This is a really challenging question, and this is really the biggest question, I think, is how do you do this? First of all, I think that we need to be setting more realistic targets. We have all these targets of we're going to do 350 million hectares, restore 350 million hectares of forest, we're going to plant 1 trillion trees. And nobody says, you know, over what time period or when. And I'd much rather see that we're planting, you know, that we're restoring 35 million hectares that's successful in 20 years. And we really need to be taking a longer term, and we need to be realistic about what we can achieve, because we're making all these promises and we're trying to solve all these complex problems through restoration, carbon, biodiversity, livelihoods. And we just, something when I talk to reporters all the time, is like, we're not going to plant our way out of climate change. This is much more complicated, and we need to set more realistic targets at a longer time scale of successful restoration, not just how much we start. So that's number one. Number two, I think the other thing is that, and I tried to emphasize this in my talk, is that we can do information exchange, we can develop methods, but we need to develop a toolbox, and we need to share that toolbox, and that toolbox absolutely has to be tailored to the local situation. There's not one size fits all. We really need to be saying, okay, oh, we know that, you know, Ramesh did this here in India, and that might work for us, or it might work, you know, somebody else did whatever in Vietnam or Costa Rica. Maybe I'll try that out, but you absolutely have to test it there. And you have to, as I said, you have to tailor the approach. You know, when people say, should I do this or not? I say, well, what's your goal? You know, if your goal is to maximize carbon and that's your only goal, then that's going to be quite different than if your goal is to, you know, restore biodiversity. And so figuring out, you know, what your multiple goals are, and then choosing the approach that fits the resilience of the system, the goals, the resources. That's what you need to be thinking about, because we do have a lot of approaches and there's not one size fits all.
Yeah, really, really important points. And sorry to lob out a really tough question there, but I think it's exciting. You all talk about it in such different ways. And so I just wanted to try to pull that together. Ramesh or Victoria, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, I was just going to emphasize the same last point that Karen has said, but maybe from a slightly different angle, right? But it's just, I don't see a contradiction between local and global, other than when the global try to homogenize, no? To use this like, okay, we are going to do it that way. And I think it's just what Karen said, it's very important to respect the local ways, and also going back to this idea of that people have different bondings with nature, right? So is by homogenizing, or by saying, oh, that's how restoration, or that's the forest how it should look like, that's when you can actually destroy the bond and the way in which people relate to nature. And this is really this idea that, okay, we need a lot of global restoration, but done in many different ways that are locally meaningful. So it's a different wording maybe of what just Karen said.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, and to add to that, Eva, I would call this the classic restoration conundrum, because our past experience puts us in a comfort zone where smaller projects are easier to manage. There is lesser heterogeneity on the site. There is closer supervision, and we feel the outcomes are much better. But the need of the hour is large-scale projects. But the learning is that even if we are restoring a 2,000 hectare plot or a 2,000 hectare site, the restoration methods that you apply in one part of the site do not work in another part of the site due to the variations in environmental and ecological parameters. And we are forced to kind of subdivide that large site into smaller plots. So if that is a learning, we could look at large-scale restoration split into smaller parcels of land. It is not important as to who manages it. It is the same organization that manages these different parcels of land, or it could be different organizations managing them. But how do we put them together is the question.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. Really, really interesting. There's some fantastic questions coming from the participants. So I'm going to put one out there that is related to traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. And I think Victoria and Ramesh, you both really talked a lot about that. So I'll put this out for the two of you. This comes from Marta, and she asks, since traditional knowledge is usually place-based and applies to specific local conditions and realities, would you have any suggestions on how to compare it to scientific knowledge, which is often a result of comparative research across larger scales? So Victoria, you put a really interesting response there. It's a controversial topic. I don't know if you want to start it off and share what you wrote in the response.
Yeah, I mean, it is a controversial topic because many scholars in the field of local knowledge, they say that when you are actually trying to translate this local knowledge into science, you are actually, I mean, there is always like this very utilitarian approach. Okay, we're gonna use this knowledge to achieve our goals, irrespectively of what are the goals of indigenous people, no? So for these scholars, it should come before. It's like it should come of like asking what are your own goals, rather than, okay, how can we use your knowledge to achieve our goals? So there is this debate on the use or on how to merge these two knowledge systems in a way that it's equal and it's not utilitarian or doesn't misrepresent the knowledge. But I think, I mean, this critique is there, and I think it's a valid critique we should take seriously. But I think there is the effort, or when you actually take this effort of like trying to bridge these two knowledge systems, the kind of like what you get, it's so large that it should be, we should aim at that, no? My emphasis will be in that we should not be aiming at that as scientists alone, but we should be aiming at doing that with the communities and also to serve their own purposes of using their knowledge, no? So, yeah.
Fascinating, yeah, thank you.
I would just follow on that. We need every piece of information out there. And I think this whole controversy, this sort of setting up like not just indigenous, but also local knowledge, opposite scientific knowledge, it just does not need to be there. And I completely agree. It's sort of like, if as an ecologist, if you think about natural history, you need to go out and observe the system before you set up an experiment. You need to talk to the people. And one of the things I plead totally guilty to myself in my own research in Costa Rica, where I work, I'm not involved as much with indigenous communities, but I'm working with local farmers, and they know so much more than me. And there's sometimes I've set things up, and I'll ask my my primary project manager in the field, who's Costa Rican, who used to farm, and he'll be like, Karen, we've known that forever, or we already know that, you didn't need to test that. And so I think that's where, as a scientist, I'm going to say, we need to be more humble, and we need to talk to people before we go in and start writing this. And it's one of the reasons, like with my graduate students, I absolutely insist they have to go to the field and talk to people before they start up their research. And that can be hard if you're in a short master's program, but there is so much knowledge out there, and it needs to be put together. And because we need to solve these problems, and we need every source of information we have.
Eva, I think we need to understand one basic difference between the two streams of knowledge, which is how the knowledge is acquired. Scientific knowledge, I believe, is acquired through a study of nature, and traditional knowledge is learning from nature. So there is a subtle but very important difference of learning about nature and learning from nature. And as a practitioner, when I read a research paper, I go back and ground truth it on the field by discussing it with the indigenous community members. And I see there is a lot of convergence between the two streams of knowledge. And that sometimes makes me wonder, as Karen just mentioned, whether the research effort was worth it at the end of the day, or should that time have been spent on researching something else. I would see these two as very complementary. But as I said in my presentation, the more we mainstream traditional knowledge, it could focus our research efforts into something which is not there in the traditional knowledge.
Yeah. Great, thank you all. Such interesting perspectives on a really complicated topic, but so important for restoration. I'm going to go to another question from a participant. This is from Bruce, and he brings up a really interesting point, and it's something I think each of you will be able to contribute to. But he talks about how many farmers in Latin America depend on shifting agriculture to renew soil fertility and reduce pests. And I would expand that, not just to Latin America, but really around the world. And how does this practice fit into forest restoration? And I would even expand that also to pastoralist cultures in, in the African continent. How do these, very traditional systems of managing land and using land that maybe don't fit into our current thoughts about restoration, how would you guys address that? Who would like to jump into that one?
Yeah, the question of pastoral practices and the impact on forests, it boils down to the carrying capacity of the forests, and where you have wild herbivores along with livestock, the carrying capacity is like overstretched. So that is where the regeneration capacity goes down. So we always have to look at the carrying capacity of the ecosystem.
Yeah, if I can, just a thought. In some, I think the answer, it depends on what you want to restore, right? In some places in Europe, in temperate forests, they actually have to restore traditional practices to get back to the ecosystem they wanted to restore, right? Because there was an ecosystem, and then they protected it, and then the ecosystem transformed because it was not a natural ecosystem, it was a managed ecosystem. So to actually get back to the pastures that you had before, that was the interest of the protected area, in some parts of Europe, they actually have to restore traditional management or the pastoral management, because what they wanted was like this diversity of pastures that they were losing unless they had the biocultural relationship, right? So I guess my answer to that question will be, is what do you want to restore? If you want to restore an ecosystem that it's partially managed, if you take out the management, then the ecosystem is going to change, right? So you have to actually have this very clear, as Karen was emphasizing. The first question is what it is that you want to restore.
Yes, absolutely. And Karen, do you have any experience with that, with the shifting cultivation aspects in the research that you've been doing? Has that ever come up, and how have you thought about that?
Shifting cultivation.
Yeah.
The main situation where I worked on that, one of my former PhD students, Marta Bonilla, studied shifting cultivation in the Yucatan Peninsula, working with some of the Mayan cultures and some indigenous groups there. And it was mostly looking at the fact that what she was looking at is that because the land had been used much less intensely, it actually regenerated quite quickly. But again, some of the later successional species didn't come back. And it was it's a monkey reserve. And so she was looking at how you get those. It doesn't make sense to go out and plant other species, but how do you get some of the later successional species back, and looking at methodologies, looking at the rates of regeneration. And that's a really good example of, you wouldn't want to go in and plant a whole bunch of species. Let's focus on some enrichment planting of species that come later in succession. It's not that particular dynamic of shifting cultivation is not really much of, it's not the situation in where I work in Southern Costa Rica. Sorry, I was trying to answer a couple, since I spoke last, and I want to apologize to people in the chat box. I tried to respond to a few of them, but it's tough to listen and type at the same time.
No, that's okay. And I think we'll have a log of all these questions so that you can maybe answer them at a later point too, because we only have just about a minute left. So I actually would like to offer each of you the opportunity to just make a closing comment or remark, or something that you just would like to leave with everybody from this session, and maybe just 10-15 seconds for each of you. Victoria, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, my main point will be that, we need to think together of what do we want to restore, and then also think on this idea of what are the drivers of nature decay, and act on those drivers, rather than, I mean, in addition to the actual deforestation that we see, or the actual nature, what are the drivers? Think about these drivers and how do we act on those? Yeah.
Great. Well, Ramesh, do you have any final parting?
I think listening to both Victoria and Karen, I'm excited by the possibility of collaborations across regions, not only in terms of learning, but also in deriving a lot of energy from each other. It's because restoration is a long-term and challenging area, and we need to be motivating each other.
Fantastic, thank you. And Karen?
I would echo Victoria that restoration is not a substitute for conservation, and we absolutely need to, first of all, be protecting what remaining ecosystems we have left. So that'd be number one. And two, as I've really emphasized, I really think we need to be planning and implementing restoration for the long term, and not focusing so much just on getting these big numbers of these targets that and we need to do it right, because there's just too many failures, and if we don't do it right, we're wasting our time and money.
Yeah, and I think doing it right, you've all talked so much about what that means and how complex it is, both from the ecological and the sociocultural perspectives. And so I think having each of you talk about that from your different experiences and disciplinary training has been really interesting to start thinking about this and grappling with these issues. So I want to thank you. I know that we could talk about this for much, much longer, and there's so much more to dig into, but thank you all for your time and your dedication to this incredible work, for sharing your experiences, for talking about it and answering these questions. think we'll have all these questions saved from the participants. And yeah, again, thank you to the ISTF group and all the students who have been organizing this, and look forward to the rest of the conference today. So, Angela or anyone else, do you guys want to add any parting words?
Yes, thank you so much, Eva, for moderating for today's panel, and thank you to all the panelists. We had so many takeaways today, from how to scale up conservation efforts to plan for the long term, to Indigenous knowledge. And as a reminder, this session is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel very soon. And we would also like to invite everyone to join us in 30 minutes at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for our breakout sessions. We have 4 breakout sessions today, so there's something for everyone. And the Zoom link for breakout session is posted in the chat now. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us today and the incredible talks from our speakers. And we will see you at our breakout session later today. Bye everyone. Thank you.